With that, I just want to thank our three authors tonight. I was going to read blurbs about all of you, but I noticed this was a very succinct blurb, so you'll have to introduce yourselves a little more.
There's not that much to say.
But they're all three historians for the Church History Department, and they can tell you more about the different projects they've been a part of. But I'll turn the time over to the three of them, and we appreciate you being here tonight.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. I'm Lisa Tait, one of the authors on the project, one of the original authors on the project. I do women's history for the Church History Department, and I've been involved in Saints and many other projects for the Church History Department. So we were telling Chris and talking about this earlier that this project has actually been 10 years in the making. I originally started researching and working on the history of the young women in 2015. The project was approved as a department project in 2016, and at that time Kate Holbrook and I were involved, and our team kind of went through some permutations. Amber Taylor, who you'll hear from, joined our team in 2019. James, who had already been kind of working with us in a consulting role, then joined as an author in 2020. And so, of course, we lost our friend Kate Holbrook in 2022. And she and I had been, as I say, involved in the project from the beginning. It was a challenge because this had never been done before. This is the first comprehensive academic history of the Young Women organization. And at the time that we started, we were just coming off of the release of the first 50 years of Relief Society. Kate and Jenny Reeder had just published, or were just getting published, at the Pulpit, collection of women's discourses. So there'd been quite a bit of work done, especially on Relief Society in the past, but Young Women was a blank, an unplowed field, I guess you could say. And so this project was a lot of spade work of getting into the sources, some of which probably had never been looked at since the day they were put in a file folder in some office. And so it meant a lot of work from the ground up to even begin to understand, like, what's the basic story here? What's the basic narrative of the Young Women organization? And why does it matter? How is it a lens that helps us to look at the history of the church more broadly, as well as focusing on the Young Women organization itself? The source base changed quite a bit over time. So in the early years of the organization, you have all these beautiful handwritten local minute books that some girl in Cedar City or somewhere would have recorded, and those were lovely and very helpful, but then those kind of fade out in the early 20th century, but by then we have publications, and we are starting to get records that the organization is keeping itself. Then later on, we get to the point where we have oral histories that we can draw on, either many that were done back in the 70s and 80s of women who were still alive then, but we were also able to do some oral histories, and that was how we were able to get some of the stories of young women and leaders that we have in the book. Because it turns out that collecting material from girls has not been a very high priority in the history of the archives. And that's not just a Latter-day Saint thing, that's true across the board. There's a whole thriving field of girlhood studies, adolescent studies, history of children and youth, and this is one of the frequent laments of people working in the field, is how difficult it is to get especially contemporaneous first-hand sources from young people. And so we had to do a little bit improvisation in that direction to get the sources that we needed. So we always had a lot to work with, but the nature of the sources changed over time. So maybe I'll just give kind of a brief overview of the history of the organization, and then we'll have Amber and James talk about some of the themes that we treat in the book about the history. And one way to do this is by looking at the names of the organization. So in 1870, May 1870, when the resolutions are signed and we have the original organization among Brigham Young's daughters, it's called the Young Ladies Department of the Ladies Cooperative Retrenchment Association. So there's already a women's retrenchment association that has been formed over the course of the preceding months under the leadership of Mary Isabella Horn and at the behest of Brigham Young. And so what this name shows us is that the Young Ladies Department, so girls are a dependent subdivision of the larger category of women. And there's this expectation that there will be intergenerational mentoring from the older women to the younger women. And then the retrenchment part for the young women originally is focused primarily on dress reform, on, cutting back on the amount of fabric and trimmings and finery that the girls are supposedly wearing. That focus on retrenchment then is what is kind of the umbrella for the initial organization of young women, young ladies associations, as they're often called, in the various wards and settlements around the Mormon corridor over the course of the 1870s. And the thing about retrenchment is that it is essentially kind of a negative focus, right? Don't do this, do without, say no. It's not very appealing for very long. And so quite soon you start to see them trying to broaden the appeal. And this is where this idea of improvement then comes in, that we're going to retrench, but we're going to do it so that we can improve ourselves in all of these important ways. Spiritually, educationally, socially, culturally. Now, in the meantime, in 1875, the young men are organized under the name of Young Men's Mutual Improvement Association. And so in a couple years later, the Young Ladies Association, the name is changed to Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association so that it's more parallel with the young men. And this idea of improvement becomes the umbrella that they're operating underneath. So up until like the 1890s, the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association is still basically building on these local associations. They're quite autonomous. They all kind of know what they're supposed to do and what it's supposed to look like, but there's not central directives coming out about this organization is supposed to look like this. And so they would meet in their local wards every week or two. They would sing, they would pray, they would testify, they would do readings, maybe some poetry, and all under this idea of trying to uplift and improve each other spiritually and in other ways as well. So then in the 1890s, around the turn of the century, the YLMIA, like other church organizations, begins to become more centralized. And there's a general board that's formed, and they start sending out lessons, and then they start sending out outlines and calendars, and so the organization becomes very more centralized, more standardized. And the young ladies and the young men now start to work more closely together. So, as I say, the young part begins to eclipse the ladies part. So where the original Young Ladies Association is seen as kind of a subdivision of the women's organization under the heading of the Relief Society and so forth, now they shift to become more of a youth organization parallel with the young men. And the two begin working more closely together, and they become known as the MIA. And in the early 20th century, they embraced the progressive recreation movement. And by the 1920s, they are actually designated by the first presidency, the MIA is designated as the recreational agency of the church. And they developed this theory of teaching the gospel through activities. So you go to Sunday school, you go to seminary, and that's the lecture hall, that's where you learn the principles of the gospel. But then you come to MIA to do things, to put those principles into action. And this is when we get the development of these iconic MIA elements like Golden Green Balls, road shows, drama, festivals, June conferences, Beehive Girls, Gleaners, all of these elements that extend quite some time into the 20th century all have their roots in this period. And that emphasis on teaching the gospel through activities, or what they come to call spiritualized recreation, is the animating imperative of the MIA up until the 1970s. In 1934, the name changes to Young Women's Mutual Improvement Association. That's more modern than Young Ladies, apparently. But they maintain this same focus on spiritualized recreation, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until the middle of the 20th century is what we call the heyday of the MIA, or the apotheosis of the MIA, where you have, 10,000 kids down on the stadium floor of the University of Utah Stadium, and the dance festivals and those kinds of things. And it's really cool. It's really amazing. It's very vibrant. It's the flagship of the church. It garners a lot of positive attention for the Latter-day Saints. It becomes a really important missionary tool as the church is going out and starting to expand internationally. But that very size, the kind of American-centric nature of the programs, that all kind of contains the seeds of its demise. Because by the 1960s, the international growth of the church has taken off to the extent that it's overtaking all other considerations. And it's becoming clearer and clearer that this massive program cannot be exported to international settings. They don't have the people, they don't have the tradition and the knowledge, and also they're not American. And a lot of the elements just don't translate very well. So in 1972, under the correlation movement, there is what we call the wrecking ball moment, where the MIA is basically discontinued. It happens between 1972 and 1974. And that recreation focus is jettisoned, and the organization is kind of split away from the young men so that it's more of its own thing and comes to be known as simply Young Women, as we have it today. That's 1974. And that ushers in, as you can imagine, a period of a lot of turmoil and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of, trying to figure out how to turn this huge ship and reorganize and reorient themselves. And the imperative is to be more spiritual and to simplify so that the Young Women programs can be taken out to the world. And it takes a decade for that to kind of shake out and for them to find their footing again. And that happens really firmly under the leadership of Ardith Kapp in the 1980s. She serves from 1984 to 1982. And she had been in the Young Women presidency in the 1970s, so she had seen the turmoil, she knew the old program, she knew kind of what the vision for the new program was, and she was able to kind of put everything together and create this new framework for the Young Women organization with the theme, with the values, elements that then structured the Young Women program. Really, there's still echoes of it today, but really up until about 2019, 2020, that basic framework that she put in place endured. So we go from young ladies retrenchment, to young ladies mutual improvement, to young women's mutual improvement, to young women. And that's the kind of the brief overview of the history. So James first is going to talk about some of the themes that we found in the history.
All right, thank you, Lisa. One of the insights from Lisa's dissertation work that she brought to the book is that when you have an organization for young women, you're actually learning about what older women think about the young women, right? It's constantly a place where we're asking questions about what does the future look like and which parts of the past are still relevant. And so in that way, the book is kind of an interesting history of the church and this question about how do you transmit a religion. Some of the key historical points in terms of how that organization Lisa just described is intersecting with the larger world and society are heightened moments of generational crisis. I think a lot of us today can recognize that there's moments like maybe now where the world feels like it's changing quite rapidly, and older generations aren't always sure what are kids these days doing. And we have big debates over those affect the shape of society. It turns out that's not new. That's the entire history of this organization is waves of generational crisis. So they used to think that the Young Ladies Retrenchment Society, which is the beginning of the Young Women Organization, started in 1869. We found out that's wrong. It was in 1870. But maybe the reason they thought it was 1869 is that's when the railroad arrived to Utah. And that's this sort of immediate wake-up moment for an adult generation that the next generation is not going to share their life experience. The pioneer, like walking across the plains had been a defining experience for so many people. That was over. You also had sales catalogs, right, that were going to bring in these more available physical goods. And so the beginning of the organization is partly how do we react to this technological change in the world that's giving us social change. Another moment we thought was super interesting was looking at the 1918 pandemic. During the COVID pandemic, we were going back and doing further research on what's the rhetoric around this other pandemic. And they're recording this is the first time everywhere in the church we've been shut down at once and nobody's holding activities. The 1918 pandemic disproportionately killed young people. There'd be like an immune overreaction. And so you also see a lot of rhetoric in church channels about how it's better to live for one glorious hour and use it to the fullest than dull years that go wasted. And I understood a lot more where the 1920s came from when I realized there's a whole generation that heard these messages. And so you see people sort of reacting against all the fashion and social and recreational changes of the 1920s. And then the church kind of deciding to almost embrace it, at least compromise with the things. They put together a social committee where they say we're going to talk about things and figure out how to channel and create a culture of recreation within the church that can kind of work with this impulse. We could go on and on about that. Obviously, the late 1960s are one of those key moments where we're both trying to channel the sense that people want to change the world and be part of something bigger, but also really concerned about sexual revolution and all the things that have happened. That's leaders who see that coming and see it building toward, I think we associate the late 1960s because like the fashion for music changes so abruptly, right? But as we looked over the 1960s, these conversations are starting to unfold, and you have things like For Strength of the Youth that emerge to prepare. Some of the correlation movement motivation is, again, sort of moral defense or cultural defense, as well as the administrative things that we talk about a lot. And so you see that again. It was interesting too, we traced what's the average marriage age for young women, and it creeps up in the early decades of the organization, and by the turn of the century is a little higher, and the percentage of people getting married is lower. Of course, in polygamous years, if you were a woman in Utah and you wanted to get married, you could get married, right? So you have a very high marriage rate. By the turn of the century, we have a lot of people who are very active in organization leadership who never marry and embrace this sort of new woman type. By the 1950s, in the post-World War II era, the marriage rate is very young. I think it comes back down from maybe 22 or 23, turn of the century, to 20. That explains a lot about how, for many years, the Young Women program had such a marriage emphasis, because it really was marriage preparation for the majority of young women who went through. They were going to be settling down within, well, while still in the program, because then the program included people in their early 20s. It didn't end at age 18 yet. When you look at the tail end of the 20th century and then the 21st century, the average age of marriage just goes up very rapidly, and marriage rates lower, right? There's more and more women where that's just not part of their life. And we watch sort of how does the organization adjust and incorporate that? How do they look at different ways of expressing discipleship? So it was interesting to see the way we continue to wrestle with demographic as well as technological change. So generational crisis is always with us. It's interesting to see how that becomes a negotiation, a prayerful negotiation through generations of leaders as they work with these youth. Which leads us to the next theme. We thought this book was a really interesting look at what it means to be a leader in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that's true at many levels. One of the opening anecdotes is about a young woman named Henrietta Lunt, who's in Cedar City. And you've got these sort of leading sisters from Salt Lake who are going through the settlements and calling people to get retrenchment organizations set up. And there's economic differences between Salt Lake and settlements and age differences. But they call her and say, okay, we're calling you to lead, put this together. And she's not sure what to do because this is not an established program. There's no manuals, there are no things. They just say, okay, we want you to push these initiatives and teach the gospel. And then we trace how this group kind of finds its identity. And this young woman, by virtue of being called to leadership, sort of grows into and takes on that role. There's interesting examples later in the book of how sort of grassroots leadership results in significant institutional change. I really like the story of Emily Hillam Higg, who is a single mother in the 1920s. Her son's got severe respiratory problems, and doctors encourage her to get him as much air as possible. So during vacations and whatever, they're actually going up the canyon and sleeping there, and even when they're home, they've got a separate outdoor sleeping area for him. She gets attached to the notion of the outdoors and sort of the social and spiritual as well as physical benefits, and starts the girls' camp tradition, which is such a central kind of rite of passage for young women in every generation since then in the church. And it was nice to see the innovation of this stake young women leader and the way she works with other authorities to get that set up and launched, and then the way it scales. So you see leadership there. A lot of the leadership we're looking at is just mentorship from local leaders who connect with young women. Often we'd see that through the eyes of young women we were able to interview or get some documents from and watch how they make decisions. There's a story I love from the 1970s, which is that institutionally complicated period, But for a lot of the young women, the most important thing was not what's happening with the program, it's who do I have a relationship with? And we interviewed a British woman who's biracial in that period. There's a lot going on, and different, not the most stable home environment, and she joined the church as a young woman. Church was really important to her. And she said her leader, whose name was, I believe, Maureen Cuthbert, was her port of call whenever she was struggling with something. And I loved a moment where she said, okay, years later, she's no longer a young woman, she's a charge nurse at a hospital, and having this stable, successful life where she feels good with things. And she still finds herself wondering when she faces a difficult decision, what would Maureen do? How would she face this? And I loved that image of how sort of leadership, just by counsel, example, presence, gets embedded in somebody's psyche, right? And she's got that source forever. And then, of course, we looked at sort of general young women's leadership. We looked at general presidents, their counselors, their boards, which in some periods are quite large, as people are coming together to create these expansive programs, and the way they're thinking about things. It was super interesting looking at Ardith Kapp's process as she realizes there's gaps in these programs, right? We changed them in that wrecking ball era, and young women have different cultural and social needs. We need to give them more to hang on to. And the way that she follows the sort of foundational Latter-day Saint ideal of learning by study and faith. She's kind of broad in the way she draws on external research and ways of framing things, but also, has this religious vision. The way she talks about the need for a theme for young women is that young men have scripture that talks about what does it mean to be a deacon and a teacher. And of course that wasn't made for them. Young men weren't filling those offices when the revelations were received, but it had become an anchor and a guide for them. She wants that for young women. And she wants it to be as connected to a revelatory process. There's a moment where she says, okay, they've worked together, she's counseled with other people, they've filled walls with ideas, and then things start to distill and crystallize for her, and she says, I've been to the mountain. You have this markedly revelatory language that she uses to describe her process. And then, in a correlated structure, there's the question of, all right, when you've got a vision, how do you build consensus and bring this whole structure along, especially in a cultural moment where people are not necessarily super used to listening to women? And so there's a really interesting story there that I think this book tells, as it takes people a little bit behind the curtain to say, what does it actually look like to lead, to minister, to seek revelation, and to build consensus in this faith. So thank you.
You'll have to forgive me, James gets me choked up. Just kidding. Kind of inhaled my saliva over there, forgive me. Hopefully my voice will cooperate. The privilege of going, or the benefit of going last, is that they've already set up a lot of the stuff that I want to talk about, but they also stole a little bit of my thunder. Just kidding. But I want to build on, especially on some of the things that James and Lisa talked about. One of the things we noticed, at least fairly on in my experience, I joined in 2019, was this sense of, and it had already kind of been defined by a Latter-day Saint scholar, Armand Moss, this idea of, in his book, The Angel in the Beehive, that there are moments throughout Latter-day Saint history where the church is kind of a little bit more open to the world and embracing of the world, not in a we're going to be of the world way, but that we're going to take the good of the world and we're going to share with the world. We're going to have a better relationship with the world. And then there are moments when they pull back, retrenchment, right? That is the very definition of that. And he calls it retrenchment and what's the word? Engagement? No, we call it engagement. What does he call it?
Assimilation?
Yeah, retrenchment and assimilation. We called it engagement. We thought that was a more a more, I think, descriptive term of what was happening. And we noticed this really early on. I mean, the whole organization starts with retrenchment, right, in that era where they're really nervous about the outside world coming in to the youth that had not experienced that. They'd been cut off from the world for so long at this point. But then you see that opening up to at the turn of the century, that early part of the 20th century, where they're embracing, the Beehive Girls comes out of that moment of being interested in what's happening in the world. What are good things that are happening? In 1913, the young men, after some coaxing from the Boy Scout organization, they join the Boy Scout organization and get some concessions that they can kind of govern it locally as they wish. But the young women are looking at similar possibilities. There are other organizations for girls that can get them outdoors and teach them skills and help them develop their femininity in positive ways. And they decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do our own thing, but we're going to take from some of those. And so they take from this organization, Campfire Girls. They get permission from the organizers of that group, take some of those ideas. And there was a book that was popular, I don't know how popular it was, but they really loved it. They were absolutely fascinated by it, called The Life of the Bee by a guy named Maurice Maeterlinck in Belgium, I think, or the Netherlands. Anyway, and he describes, like, very beautifully and poetically how bees in their hive, in their community, they go out into the world and into the flowers, right, and take the nectar and bring it back to benefit the whole hive and to grow and so they absolutely latch onto this idea and create the Beehive Girls program, which it's really the manual itself that for decades also just absolutely integrates that symbolism. There's flowers everywhere. They're choosing names for themselves that are made up of flower names. They're told to go out and gather and bring back to their swarm. They call their groups their swarm, and they have different levels that they can move from the gatherer of the honey to the builder of the hive, gatherer of the honey, and keeper of the bees, right? So they're just really embracing this notion. Of course, it works really well in Utah as the beehive state, and they're really embracing that. They go through this period, and then there is a moment where they're a little bit concerned about how the modern world is coming in and maybe influencing some of their theology, or they wouldn't have called it that, but the way they're thinking about religion, and maybe watering down a little bit some of that. And so that comes into the MIA in the form of the leadership is being told of the MIA that they have to be talking about the truthfulness of that they believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God, that he saw God, rather than a kind of a more social gospel approach to how they're leading youth. And that continues onward, and as Lisa mentioned, kind of the apex of this embracing of the world happens in the 1950s and 60s with what we termed the heyday of the MIA. It is quite literally like they're out showing the world their great youth. At one point I called it like it's just a spectacle. It's a spectacular moment where they're and they love it. They get the Time magazine and they get other people commenting on the youth program in this period, and they see that and they say, intrinsically they're essentially saying, yes, look at our great youth. By the fruits, if by their fruits you might know them, then look at our fruits. They're doing great, right? So that's also the period of expansion. That's where it really starts to pick up in missionary work throughout the world, right? And so they're able to use the MIA program, similarly, the spiritual recreation idea, to bring people to these activities and then teach them the gospel through activities and lessons and things like that. And it's really quite successful. The MIA program turns out to be an important part of missionary work. And they're also able to tell themselves, look at the truthfulness of what we have here. We're producing really good, strong, stalwart youth. And it helps that it, in this period, really kind of aligns with American culture. As I mentioned, it's kind of this open period, a period of openness to the world. And they're really embracing kind of many values of the American culture. But soon the American culture starts to shift away, right, in the 1960s. And then you see that that's a period of retrenchment. But it's not just that. It's also, they've expanded all throughout the world. As Lisa mentioned, the seeds of their demise is in the expansiveness of this program. It just wasn't sustainable. It certainly isn't sustainable on an international level. Trying to implement the kind of vastness of the program that the MIA was, internationally just wasn't feasible. And so part of what's happening in the correlation period is addressing how do we get right to the basics and help people to embrace the very fundamentals of the gospel everywhere, and MIA is a part of that. So I won't belabor that point, but I think you'll have a lot of fun reading in that period in the 1950s and 60s, just all of the things that they were doing, all of the festivals, all of the dancing. There's just so much going on, and it was really fun. But as I mentioned, this is also the period that it's moving internationally. And what I do at the Church History Library is more focused on the international church. So I lead a team right now that we're working on telling the history of the church in different regions of the world. And so I'm really interested in how this looks internationally. And it's really, it's kind of fun to watch this development through the book. They don't know that the program is so Utah and United States centric, right? And why would it be otherwise? That's what they know. And so they're kind of trying to put a square peg in a round hole in many places throughout the world, trying to implement this very American program. And you see them gradually becoming more and more aware of this. That's part of the reason, as I said, they've got to pull back and get back to the fundamentals. And so they're adjusting all throughout, trying to figure out how do we make this work for our youth all throughout the world? How do we make this feel more applicable and something that they're going to be engaged in? And they succeed to different degrees throughout the book. But I don't know I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to share one of my favorite moments of kind of that awkward fit. And it has to do with camp, which happens to be one of my favorite parts of Young Women's. But if you think about camping, it's a very Western tradition. It's not something you do in many other parts of the world. If you're camping by necessity, right? You're living out in the land because you don't have other options, right? And so this idea of camping is really quite foreign. In the I wanted to actually come back over here. In the 1990s, the church was being organized in Mongolia, and the leaders there wanted to do girls' camp. And a lot of the people that were joining the church in Mongolia in this period were young people, and so they thought, let's do a young women's camp. So they get the young women together, and they're really enthusiastic, and they plan this camp. They don't really have tents and all of the things that you would need, so they kind of gather up from other organizations these kind of broken down tents that they're basically duct taping together to make them work. And they go out onto the Mongolian steppe. They have to go on a bus because they don't have cars to load up all of their stuff. So they try to hire a bus, which doesn't show up initially. So they're waiting there, and one of the girls goes off running and finds a guy that's a bus driver, and he comes and then he sees all these girls with all of this camp gear, and he tries to drive off. And they have to convince him to stay. And they get out there, and they realize that they've gone in the month of August, and they realize this is monsoon season. And they hadn't really prepared for that. So there's just torrential rain coming down. They all gathered at one point for their testimony meeting in this little cabin that they're just absolutely shoulder to shoulder smashed in there. And there's a fun picture as well. Oh, I'm in the wrong section. There's a fun picture of them you can see them all smashed into this little tent. If you want to look, that's on page 288. They're all smashed into this little tent. But all throughout this experience, the water's drenching all of their gear and everything else. And this is what I wanted to read because I think it's really delightful. Let's see, I'm going to skip down just a little bit. The group needed shelter for 43 girls, 7 leaders, and 4 senior missionaries who attended. 2 young women were able to bring tents to share. Thanks to the church's developing scouting program for men in Mongolia, the young women had access to 4 more tents, making 6 tents for over 50 people. Transportation to the campsite over 15 miles away was difficult. August monsoon rains had made the rough roads muddy. On the morning they planned to go, this is the story I just told you about the bus driver. I'll skip it down a little bit. Food was simpler. Young women picked wild strawberries, cooked mutton. Picked wild strawberries and cooked mutton dumpling soup over a fire. They drank warm sweet milk, a substitute for the traditional fermented mare's milk the young women had given up to adapt to their new religious commitment against alcohol. After sharing their sweetened milk, the group squeezed into a tiny cabin for a testimony meeting. As night descended, so did the monsoon rains. Water quickly seeped through the tents and onto the young women crammed in head to toe inside. Fortunately, their heavy wool blankets provided some protection. But then as you read on, and in the oral history interview with Sister Cook that we did to learn about this story, she talks about how the girls were just absolute smiles and so happy to be there. They just made it wonderful. And I think that's one of the really cool things and themes that we see is despite the awkward fit, it really does have an important impact, and the young women have a really positive experience time after time. And another story, I won't share too much of it, but it's a young woman in Africa who her mother had died. She was raised by her aunt. She joins the church and finds this group, this sense of home there that she hadn't had really before in her life, and it's really important to her. But even still, she was very different from the other girls in the ward. She didn't have a mother or a father. She had her aunt raising her, and she was more poor. She wasn't able to go to the good schools. But it was her young women leader who helped her to develop an identity and understand her relationship with God, and develop the confidence to continue and to move forward. So that's another story that you can look forward to. I think there's a lot more that we could talk about, but I think you'll find both a lot of interesting academic themes, but things that you'll relate to, stories and experiences that will ring true, and especially I think it's fun seeing how they adapt to the church growing internationally throughout the world. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Anybody from the audience have any questions for these authors?
Do you want us to go up here?
That doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
My question is, I think about 1889 they started the Young Women's Journal, and how is that associated with the Young Ladies Association? And why did they start it at that point?
Yeah, well, how long have you got?
It's in the book.
This is my dissertation, but.
Oh, really? Really? Oh.
Yeah, Susie Young Gates started it partly because she wanted a personal literary project, but she, from the beginning, envisioned and created the magazine as the magazine of the Young Ladies Mutual Improvement Association. So from the beginning, she's working with Elmina Taylor, who's the president, and the general board that's just kind of coming into being and growing during the 1890s. So the Young Women's Journal was the official organ of the YLMIA, and it had kind of a rocky road in the 1890s, but then it became very successful and thrived until 1929, when, for reasons that are hard to totally unpack, they merged with the improvement era.
Juniper Instructor, that's when
The
it
improvement
ended
era.
too, yeah. But
Yeah, to become the magazine of the MIA. Yeah.
They advertise that as a marriage, the two. Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm actually doing a paper right now that's going to go into a lot more detail about that.
about the
About the merger.
1929 merger. Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, it's a really interesting story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny that one of them's called Young Women's, and then the association's called Young Ladies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you notice it's woman, not women.
Oh,
it's
is it? Okay.
Woman singular.
Okay, is it Young
And
Woman?
that reflects Susie Young Gates and also Mormon women's involvement in the larger women's movement of the late 19th century. The idea of woman as this overarching category that captures all women, and that women have this common identity and this common cause. That's kind of all captured in the name of the magazine. And Sousa edits it until 1900, so for 11 years, and those are the years where she's really involved in the National Council of Women and suffrage and all of those kinds of things. And so she brings this larger consciousness of woman and the woman's movement into the journal. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you bet. Like I said, I could talk about it for a long time.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So WOMAN as opposed to WOMEN.
Ian,
Yeah.
right.
And then apostrophe S. Yeah.
And
Just like the woman's exponent,
yeah.
the newspaper that Emmeline Wells edited was also woman, singular.
And Abraham Cannon was part owner of it, right?
Yeah, yeah. I published a long article about this in the Journal of Mormon History in 2010 that traces the business development of the journal.
Well, I gotta go back and look at that.
You could look at that, but yeah, it was always published by Cannon and Sons,
Yeah.
which also published the Juvenile Instructor, and
Yeah.
then they came to publish the Contributor, and so they were kind of the publishing house. They're the forerunner of Deseret Book.
Mhm.
And Cannon was a real supporter and actually helped keep the journal going, even though it wasn't selling enough to cover its expenses. And then he died suddenly in 1896, and that precipitated kind of a crisis about whether the journal was going to continue or not. The Contributor died with Abraham Cannon. He had been editing that. And so there's a whole story there about how the women mustered their, pulled up their skirts and girded their loins and went out and sold off the back issues and got the journal on a sound financial footing. And what really did it was that they started publishing the lessons in the journal. And so that made it an indispensable part of the program.
Hmm.
So they actually cut the subscription cost in half, but then they more than doubled their subscriptions after they started publishing the lessons. So to me, it's a very interesting story. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm that's very interesting to me, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, like I say, I laid it all out in that JMH article, if you
Okay.
want to look at that.
Yeah, I go back and look at it, yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds interesting. And I don't know, my other question was, why, in Mongolia, why didn't they use yurts?
Because they were two very American mission
Too
leaders.
too American, and they didn't even think about trying to use.
The little cabin, I think, actually, that they gathered in for the testimony meeting, I think you would call it a yurt, but
Oh, okay.
they didn't all stay.
I was just
stay in
curious
that.
because it's funny that they're struggling with tents when they have a culture with yurts,
Well, except I think that a lot of the early growth of the church in Mongolia was in the city.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
it
guess
was.
that's true.
Yeah, yeah.
And so.
Yeah.
Which is why they had to hire the bus to get out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think maybe the girls there are a generation or two at least removed from that
The yurts, yeah.
yurt tradition or culture.
I'm curious about, he talked about, well, you both talked about some of the key figures that were behind the early YMMIA and so on. Who is there anybody that's sort of the unspoken hero that keeps things going after those initial women pass away? Is there a name, anybody that sticks out that was?
I think there's a lot of significant transitional figures. The title of the book, Carry On, is taken from Ruth Mae Fox's hymn that she wrote. They have a contest for a song to celebrate the church centennial.
Okay.
And then they don't like anything that's submitted to the
entries.
contest of the
Oh,
entries.
sure.
Nothing. I mean, there's things they admire, but she's like, nothing captures this whole spirit. And this is an important time, and we need to do something. So the young women president just leaves and writes this hymn and comes back and says, "This is it," and people agree.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good
Is
hymn.
that Love One Another?
No, this is Carry On.
Actual title, yeah.
And the holding aloft our colors are the gold and green. If you
And they
remember gold and
actually,
green balls,
marched
they
through
did.
the tabernacle with their
Holding their
holding
colors.
aloft their
Yes.
colors.
Yeah. And
As they're
Fox
singing
is an
it.
interesting figure because she's, 74, 75 or something when she's called to be the General Young Women President. She's actually the same age or older than Maddie Tingey, who she replaces. And she was a pioneer. She was born in England and walked across the plains as a young woman. And yet here she is as the president of the YLMIA, which under her leadership becomes the YWMIA, in the 1930s at this moment of real self-conscious modernity. The idea that we live in the modern world now, and what does that mean, and how are we going to move forward in the modern world? And here she is as this, by all other standards, elderly woman who yet has a lot of vision and leadership, partly because of who she surrounds herself with. She surrounds herself with younger progressive women who are, you know, well fitted to bring the church into the modern world. I mean, the thing is that, like, the young women leaders generally are not well known. Ardith Kapp is probably the exception. Maybe Elaine Cannon. Some people may remember or recognize the name Elaine Cannon. But all the way along, Elmina Taylor, Maddie Tingey, Lucy Grant Cannon, Bertha Reeder, like, these are not names that people know.
Right.
And Elmina is the first general president, called in 1880, and she lives till 1904, like was the tradition at the time. She dies in office. And she's very elderly by that point. But she really has put the organization on a very firm footing by the early 20th century. She's developed the general board, they've started doing the lessons, and, you know, they've got a thing going that the other women who come along are able to build on, to inherit, to hold on to the traditional things, but also then expand and build on what was there before. So there's this really great tradition of wonderful women leaders, and people just don't know them. So we hope that the book will, you know, help to change that.
Also, too, we do talk about some board members who are just fascinating. Elsie Talmadge Brandley is
Yes.
somebody who kind of captured our imagination. She would be an example of one of those 1930s board members thinking about
Yep.
what is it
Modernity.
like. Cheiko Okazaki was on the board.
In the 60s.
Yeah, and that's the first example of, like, a person of color in general church leadership, right? It's the young women organization that was first willing to say, this works, we want you to serve. So, boards are worth paying attention to, too.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, especially up until the Wrecking Ball
guillotine,
era.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'm sorry for all those that missed out on a great conversation and important information. Thank you for writing the book.
Thank you for having us.
And